All right. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's actually really fun to talk to an audience who's basically not in my industry. One of the first things that I heard today when I came here, and I think actually one of the first things that I hear whenever I speak to a non-security audience is that it's much worse than I think. One of the first conversations I had was, oh, no, it's much worse than that. Okay. That's obviously the kind of things that you tell each other and you talk about within your teams, but you don't tell the security department, right? But I don't want to talk about the threats of today and the low-hanging fruit and all the other kinds of stuff that we very often speak about at security events. What I want to talk to you about are the potential threat scenarios of the future. Now, I watched the intro video, not the recap video, but the intro video that was looping over and over backstage. Had the pleasure of watching it about 50 times, I think. And one thing that I learned from that is that using Qt, you can launch an intercontinental ballistic missile from the bow of a super yacht while listening to Bohemian Rhapsody or something. So you guys are working in all kinds of spheres, which is incredible. But hopefully what I can do is bring you a flavor of what someone approaching it from a security mindset thinks when looking at this technological development, advancement, and so on. So there are many things that drive change in society in general. Some of them, of course, are technological. We've seen over the past maybe decade rolling and increasing adoption of cloud-based technologies, for example. I'm sure developers in the Qt framework in some instances are taking advantage of container-based platforms to do development. It seems like a perfect place to implement that, which is really slowly being adopted in enterprise. Some of them are regulatory. So things like the EU General Data Protection and Regulation, which has changed the way that enterprises collect information, store, handle, and protect information, how they do breach notification. In fact, you could be forgiven for thinking that since we introduced GDPR, we've had more breaches than ever before. Of course, that's not the case, but now people have to tell you when it's happened, whereas previously they were keeping quiet about it. So there are regulatory changes, there are technological changes, and there are societal and behavioral changes as well, how we use and adopt technology, what we do with it, where we fit it into our lives. In fact, I was just having a discussion on Twitter this morning with a journalist about, because I have a 1-year-old at home, whether screen time for small children is good or bad and how you police that and what you do with it. And then I was thinking about my own childhood. And I think when I was 2 or 3 years old, I'm pretty sure we only had 2 TV channels, maybe 3, I'm that old. And kids' TV was only 1 hour a day. So there was no question of regulating screen time because there was no option to have it as a kid anyway. 1 hour was the max. So society changes as well. So I wanted to focus on a few of those technologies and hopefully the ones that I think touch you the most or that in areas that you focus on or use the most. And the first one of those is 5G. So 5G as a network infrastructure, as a technology, it's already being switched on in various places. London, for example, I know 5G has already started to go live. Due to some of the constraints about the physical constraints about how 5G works, it needs more base stations closer together. So we'll see it switched on, first of all, in more urban, dense environments than out in the countryside, because it will require more and different infrastructure to make it work in those distributed environments. But 5G, as with every other iteration of mobile connectivity and technology, brings some really interesting changes. So if you think all the way back, I don't know if we called it 1G or if we just called it G, I don't know. But if you think all the way back from G all the way to where we are now, every change, every iteration from 2G, 2.5G, if you remember Edge and GPRS, 2.5G, 3G, 4G, they've all brought not just changes in the infrastructure, but because of it alters the way that we get to use the infrastructure, it brings a whole load of other changes in its wake. And many times they're kind of seismic in terms of the changes they bring. So without 3G, for example, we wouldn't be in the world of the smartphone. I don't know if you have an Android or an iPhone and you find yourself in the middle of nowhere and you drop back to a GPRS or an Edge network and suddenly your phone is no more than a paperweight or a brick. It can't do much. So without 3G as an infrastructure, we wouldn't have seen those advancements into smart devices like tablets and smartphones that we have today. So there was a whole industry that grew up around that. With 4G, obviously, we had an increase in available bandwidth and speed. And I think, arguably, without 4G, we wouldn't have seen the rise of things like Netflix, Spotify, Apple Music, all of the media streaming platforms and services that we all use effectively today. If you try and imagine using Netflix over a 3G connection, it's an incredibly frustrating experience. I don't know if you've tried it. And of course, obviously that's a new industry, the Netflixes and the Spotifys. Although Netflix did start as a DVD rental company. I don't know if you knew that. They used to put DVDs in envelopes and post them to you, and then you would post them back when you were finished with them. But they changed with the times, took advantage of the infrastructure. But it doesn't only give rise to those new industries. Think about the back end as well, content generation. So recording artists, film studios, labels, music labels, they've all had to change the way that they do business to cope with this new delivery infrastructure. And then it has knock-on effects in other industries as well. So take that music industry example. Not only do the record labels have to work out now new mechanisms of delivering music, taking advantage of the new platform, artists have to work out new schedules for the creation and release of new music, because one album every 2 years is probably not going to cut it in an on-demand, real-time environment. And not only that, because the money that you make from a single stream on Spotify is extremely low, artists are beginning to refocus a lot on live performance and merchandise because they make more money from doing that. So actually, the development of 4G and then those platforms has led to a resurgence in live music venues. So really, the changes can go a long way back as technology changes and advances. With 5G, I think what you're looking at is something which is really going to be the underpinning of what has become known as IR, Industrial Revolution 4.0, so the next industrial revolution. The reason I say that is because 5G obviously brings with it exponentially greater bandwidth, so the same order of magnitude increase that we've seen every time we will see again with 5G, but it also brings extremely low latency to the picture as well. And extremely low latency will be a game changer for industry, for the places where you're developing for. So I know some of you work, for example, in the automotive industry. There's a lot of talk and coverage and development in autonomous vehicles, whether that's tractors or trucks or cars on the roads, whatever it may be. Without 5G, a future of truly autonomous vehicles everywhere wouldn't happen, because you need that super low latency. Your car needs to be able to exchange data not just with other cars, but with the environment, vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to environment, what's become known as the V2X environment, vehicle to everything. And it needs to be able to exchange and use that information faster than the human brain can. Otherwise, it will be a worse driver than a person sometimes, depending where you drive. So that low latency is really going to drive that industry forward, excuse the pun. There are many other use cases as well. Think, for example, medical. So 5G will make it absolutely doable for a surgeon based in the US to carry out remote surgery on a patient in Australia, for example. Because the key thing for a surgeon when in an operating environment is that speed of reaction. If something goes wrong, they have to be able to react immediately to correct or to rectify what went wrong, or even just to react to the way that the body is reacting to surgery, for example. You couldn't do that over a current 4G connection. You will do it over a 5G. Well, you won't do it, I hope, but somebody will, over a 5G connection. So 5G will really drive that next industrial revolution, that next wave of innovation. And the other thing that goes alongside it is the increasing adoption of IPv6, the addressing scheme, among other things. You probably know that IPv4, we ran out of IP addresses several years ago, publicly assignable IP addresses. So one of the things that IPv6 was developed to combat was this lack of addresses. It has a much bigger address space. And if I put that into context, IPv6 has enough individual routable addresses to give an address to every atom on the surface of the planet. and have enough left over for 2 or 3 more planets, depending on how big they are. That's not an exaggeration. That's how big it really, truly is. But then if you think back, looks like there are some people out there as old as me. If you think back, the first computer I had that had a hard drive, the hard drive was 20 meg. And I remember thinking at the time, there is no way I'm ever going to fill 20 meg of space. I'm never going to have that much data. Of course, I was very, very wrong. So I think from the standpoint of today, when we look at an IPv6 address space, we go, wow, that's enough forever. I think anyone who thinks that will end up being very, very wrong in much the same way, because we're not just going to be giving addresses to physical devices. Of course, we'll be giving addresses to virtual devices and digital services as well, and that will grow exponentially. If it can be connected, it will be connected. So from a business perspective, in a previous life, one of the jobs I used to have was as a security and privacy architect. So it was my job to draw architecture diagrams of an environment and work out how to secure it. So I was trying to draw an architecture diagram of what the enterprise of the kind of near future might look like. And the best I could come up with was this. The one thing that's really missing from that picture is a network. And that's for a good reason, in that enterprises of the very near future won't own or care about the network. That will be delivered by someone whose job it is to own and deliver network infrastructure. IT, not just security, but IT will be implemented for the sake of the business. So the IT will be business-focused, business process-focused projects, not IT for the sake of IT. If you think about it, and this is probably a frustration of some of you out there who run your own organizations, no company ever became a world beater by being the best in the world at running Active Directory, right? That's not an area where any business really wants to focus. So the more of that you can outsource to specialists, the more you will. And your enterprise will end up looking like this. Technology focused on business processes, focused on making money for the company. You will be dealing with, obviously, your users, but every single one of those users will have multiple different profiles, not just one against their name, but it will be depending on where they are in the world, what projects they're currently working on, which network they're connected to, what device they're using. You might want to auto-apply and switch between profiles on a dynamic basis. But not only those users, you'll have all of the connected things and devices as well, maybe in the hundreds of thousands going forward. So because of all of that, you'll be generating mountains of data. And I'll give you some figures on that later on, but far more data than your organization will be able to cope with. Not just log monitoring for security events, but all of the data generated by your organization. So at the core of everything that you do, you will have to be relying on machine learning or AI to take advantage of dealing with that volume of data and turning it into usable and useful insights in time for them to be meaningful for your business. Any of your legacy infrastructure, you will be putting in containers. So what for some of you today is kind of forward-looking development environments, using things like Docker, for example, very quickly that will become a legacy environment, and you'll be able to take things that were never really designed for modern technology, containerize them, and carry on running them if you need to. But all of your forward-looking projects will be designed more in a serverless type environment. That's absolutely where development is headed, where the only thing that you as a developer have to focus on is your code. Of course, in my industry, that brings its own challenges, because in security, then we have to say, okay, how the hell are we going to secure that when all we have is your code? We have to work out then how are we going to implement security as code within your developed code, because it's all going to go into a third-party environment anyway. So it brings all its own challenges. But that's, to my mind, what it's beginning to shape up into from an enterprise perspective. So what does that mean in terms of what do I worry about? Well, certainly 5G networks are far more volatile and far more software-defined than any 4G, 3G, and everything that came before it. So the capacity for real-time change in what has traditionally been a physical environment is very real. There's a whole new subscriber type to take advantage of, which is the machine-to-machine communications that enterprises typically have pretended doesn't happen so far. That's not going to be an option for much longer. and also what has become known as MIoT, or massive IoT deployment. So how do you do, for example, identity and access management when you're talking about machine-to-machine communications? The data I kind of spoke about, how do you maintain compliance with things like GDPR with an ever-increasing mountain of data? How do you age it out? How do you delete it securely? How do you make the best use of it? And at a time of a massive shortage of qualified individuals within information security, you're going to be asking for professionals to deal with technologies that they didn't study at college because they didn't really exist, or that they haven't used in their professional life because they didn't exist, and that have a very steep learning curve, like how do you define a volatile 5G software-defined network, at a time when it's difficult to hire an information security professional to do anything, because there aren't many of them. In fact, ISC Squared, one of the certifying bodies in InfoSec, have estimated, I think it was a 1.2 million person shortfall in terms of how many jobs there are to fill and how many people there are to fill them. And I think the date they put on that was 2021, so not very far away. And on top of that, of course, the more things you add over this 5G distributed architecture, the greater the attack surface. So to put an example around that, I was in Hong Kong recently, and actually, the way the world goes, I was in Hong Kong right when at the height of the riots in the streets recently. And on the day that I arrived, what the protesters had been doing in Kowloon was chopping down one of these, a smart lamppost. So the smart lamppost has Bluetooth sensors, it has 2 or 3 different video cameras and recording equipment for traffic management, among other things, I guess. Apparently, the people of Hong Kong had been assured that the cameras weren't switched on anyway, and even if they were, none of the data was going to China. So that was okay. And then somebody had a look at one and discovered that that wasn't necessarily the case. So the protesters were sawing what they actually did, saw one down, because they wanted to take it apart and have a look at what was inside. So smart lampposts, what I'm saying, is not the distant future. This is today's reality. But from a security perspective, think about this. If you're a IT administrator or a security administrator for a smart city, you say, okay, we've got smart lampposts. We have 160,000 smart lampposts throughout the city. They all have IP addresses. I have to take that into account in my threat model and work out what to do about it. So I'm going to make sure that I have outbound network rules so that my smart lampposts can't be used as bots, for example, in a distributed denial of service attack on somebody else. Because there's 160,000 of them. If they can be compromised, that's quite a big pool of devices. So they put the outbound firewall rule in place, and they think everything's great. But at the same time, because it's a new infrastructure paradigm, they don't stop to think about, well, how do those smart lampposts get their IP addresses in the first place? Well, every single one of them has a SIM card in them. That's how they get the IP address. And so while they're busy focusing on stopping the smart lamppost from being part of a DDoS attack on somebody, the smart lampposts are busy dialing up premium rate numbers to generate income for a cybercriminal. It's outside the threat model. It's a new way of thinking. And that's why it's a challenge for security. So that's a tiny use case. What about IoT? So IoT is a huge space. Many different devices, from the boring and mundane connected smart printer through smart lights and thermostats, and the electronic mousetrap, which it's a connected mousetrap, right? You put it in your house or your warehouse or whatever, and it has a kill chamber. And when the rodent goes into the kill chamber, it gives it an electric shock and kills it, and then sends you a jolly notification to your smartphone. I'm not entirely convinced that anything with a kill chamber should be connected to the internet anyway. And I think the last one just tells you whether you have eggs or not. I'm not sure how useful that is. I don't know what it does. Like, yes, you have eggs. So basically, it's a world which is expanding rapidly with or without a use case. Excuse my language, I hope you don't mind, but there is a fantastic Twitter account I recommend you check out called Internet of Shit. There is a lot of totally useless connected devices that you will find being parodied on accounts like that. But like, do you have eggs? I mean, these things exist. So IoT is huge and growing, and many times growing without any use case or reason. That's the world that we're in right now. So construct some threat scenarios around that. Maybe a quick show of hands in the audience. How many of you have a smart TV in your house that has webcam capability? Not many, right? And that's not surprising. Obviously, it exists. It tends to be in the higher-end devices right now that have a built-in camera. But I think as humans, particularly as that's one area where we're very similar, security professionals and developers, we don't tend to enjoy human contact very much. So the idea of having a big TV in your living room where you can have nice face-to-face chats with people isn't particularly appealing. And I think that's probably true of humans in general. When you think about how much time and effort we invest in text-based communications now with the explicit aim of avoiding talking to someone, I think that's not surprising that the camera stuff hasn't taken off. But say it does. What's the threat scenario there? If you have a TV with a camera on it in every living room on the planet, what's the threat scenario? Well, if you're thinking to yourself, what would I do? Ooh, spying on people and extortion. Well, then you're beginning to think like a hacker, which is great. But you're not thinking like a criminal. Because if you then try and think about, well, how do I monetize that? It starts to get really complicated. It would be like the world's worst and biggest version of Big Brother. You would have all of these incoming video feeds that you would have to monitor for when someone did something stupid or embarrassing or extortion-worthy in multiple languages. You'd then have to work out a way of identifying who that person was and where they were and how you could communicate with them in order to do the extortion. And then you'd have to work out a way to allow them to pay you and all the other logistical challenges around that. So actually, as a threat model, it's not really there. But if you want to think like a criminal, what would you do with that? It goes back to that DDoS model or something like that. You have a whole bunch of low-powered computing devices networked in people's homes. If you can get onto that network and colonize the TV set, for example, the chances that any security mechanisms are going to find you and stop you once you're in there are extremely low. In fact, we're running a hacking contest today, right now, in Tokyo called Pwn to Own. And smart TVs are one of the categories that are up there to be hacked. If you hack it, you win the TV and you take it home. It's a great contest. True story. Last year, Tesla was in the competition, and if you hacked it, you won the Tesla and took it home. They're donated by the manufacturer. So, yeah, Pwn to Own, that's Tokyo. Takes place in Tokyo, takes place in Canada later this year as well. And we just introduced a new one this year for industrial control systems. I don't know why you would want to own an ICS and take it home, so I guess that's going to be cash prizes. But that stuff's out. What else? Who owns one of these devices? I have to put my hand up twice for this slide. So think about these. You have the possibility of targeted surveillance in every home. There's already been news stories about who heard what recordings and what they did with the recordings, and there was a story of someone's private conversations being emailed to somebody else because they had asked that conversation to be sent as a message, according to Amazon. But they hadn't, and it was really embarrassing because it was about the person that it got sent to. And these organizations, these companies keep your data either for a very long period of time, and by your data I mean audio and video footage, either for a very long time or indefinitely. So there's already this capability of targeted surveillance of effectively every home in the nation. There was a fantastic news story yesterday. This is the thing about threat modeling. Suddenly something comes along and you go, oh shit, that wasn't in my threat model at all. I have to completely rethink. Just yesterday I was reading a story that smart speakers, and that's both Amazon and Google, and I think Apple as well, anything with a microphone basically, can be exploited with a laser. Because the microphone obviously reacts to vibrations of air to turn into audio signals. And it also reacts to the vibrations caused by photons. So if you can focus a laser on the speaker from up to 350 meters away, then you can make the smart speaker do things like unlock the front door. So if you're a burglar and you go, oh, Amazon, marvelous, I'll just get my laser out, unlock door. This is the world we're heading to. So these things exist. So this targeted surveillance thing, it's a reality. But again, for the same model, is that a typical threat scenario for most people? No, because we're not all special individual snowflakes. No one really cares about each one of us. We're not interesting enough. Of course, if you're in a certain industry or a certain environment, if you're a government, working in a government department, for example, then probably you should be worried about targeted state surveillance. But if you work in your local record shop, probably less worried. So that's one area, IoT and connected devices. Another area, maybe this will give you a clue, another area that I wanted to explore, if you've seen the film. Second clue. Yeah. Artificial intelligence, right? Didn't work out so well for humanity in that example. I don't think so, Dave. Sorry, Dave. Or this one. Also didn't work out so well for humanity. Stories of artificial intelligence becoming sentient, going crazy, and sending Arnold Schwarzenegger back in time to murder children, or something like that. We're not there yet, okay? But what I'm saying is that AI, artificial intelligence, and the subset of that is machine learning, is already and has been already a popular trope in science fiction for a very, very long time. It's great fodder for journalists to look at and build stories about. And we are already making mistakes in our implementation. But Skynet, we're not there yet. So there's a company in London, DeepMind. They were acquired by Google. I was listening to a podcast recently, and they were walking through one of the rooms or floors of DeepMind, where they quite literally have robots that are learning. Do you remember cup and ball, where you have like a cup on a stick and a ball, and you throw it up and you catch it? They have robots that are learning to do that. That's where we're at right now with Skynet. Less threatening. But AI is developing rapidly in great strides, maybe not the robotics side of it. And it will change the security landscape. So if you think about it from an attacker perspective, what does that mean from a security perspective? My areas of concern are these, that with artificial intelligence, attacks will become obviously more rapid, more quick to react, and more effective at what they do. The malicious code that's running in any environment, so in all the ways that you will take advantage of AI in the things that you build, attackers will do the same thing, and they'll do it faster, and they'll do it with more mistakes because they don't care about QA, and they'll probably come to market a lot more rapidly than many of you. But that wasn't meant to be a joke, but okay. But the malicious code that's running in an AI scenario will be context aware. It will know where it's running, what's happening around it, what changes are being made in response to it, and how it should respond to those changes. It won't just be a monolithic piece of code running regardless. It will be able to impersonate just not only systems within your environment, but also people within your environment. It will be able to baseline an environment, look at how people interact with it, and then modify its own behavior to look like one of those people or one of those systems. So in future, why bother sending a phishing email if you can have an AI entity within an organization that can simply pretend to be the system that people are logging into, and then just harvest the passwords that way, just for example. So in terms of what we see in the threat environment, the first signs of this are already here. There's a piece of malware called Emotet, one of the most pernicious that's around at the moment. And one of the things that it was doing last year, around October time, was harvesting email threads. So in an infected environment, it was just stealing big email threads and exporting them. And we were kind of going, why is it doing that? That's a bit weird. And then in April this year, what it started doing was replying to all on those email threads and injecting some malicious content into that reply to all. So instead of being a malicious email or a piece of spam with no context out of the blue that you're less likely to click on, it was a part of a pre-existing conversation with lots of other people that you have some implicit trust in anyway, with a link in it that went to somewhere bad or an attachment that was a bad attachment. They weren't using machine learning to do that, still a manual operation, but imagine when they do. Imagine how rapid and widespread that kind of thing becomes. So I think the final stage of that for the future is autonomous cyber weapons. So we already live in a world where people are worried about autonomous kinetic weaponry, right? Where there's a petition in front of the United Nations where people are saying we cannot have a world where we have autonomous weapons, because that really is the beginning of Skynet at that point, right? Where you have not a drone with someone on a joystick at the other end of it, but a drone which you can literally take out of the box, you throw it up in the air, and it goes away, and it selects its own targets and engages when it feels it's appropriate. That's an autonomous kinetic weapon. Hopefully we won't see that future, but we didn't have such a good track record with nuclear, so probably we will. But I think in the cyber world, autonomous cyber weapons are absolutely something that we are going to have to design networks against and build security solutions for and take into account when you're developing technologies. You have to be thinking threat modeling ahead for where your stuff is going to be deployed in 4 or 5 years' time if you want to survive. If you want to just build a company and exit, I'm sure that's a different scenario. But if you want to survive, you've got to be threat modeling ahead. So that's AI. There are other things around AI as well, though. You take a look at these people, and I would like you just to have a look at the faces and see if you can spot the connection between them. None of them was ever born. These people are not people. These people were invented by a computer, by an AI. So that we're already at the stage where an AI is capable of inventing a human that has never existed before. Just to give you a shiver down the spine, a certain sense of creepiness. In some sense, some ways you can tell if you look at the lady on your left, the hair that's hanging down on the side. If you look really closely, you can see that it's a bit weird. Actually, this same neural network also makes cats. Sometimes it's really good. Sometimes it's the stuff of nightmares. Better at making humans than cats. If you're interested and you want to go and play around with it, thispersondoesnotexist.com and thiscatdoesnotexist.com are the two websites. But so we're already at that stage where neural networks are doing this. If you think about how animation and filmmaking looks now, if you saw the most recent, currently still the most recent Star Wars film, you would have seen Carrie Fisher at the end as Princess Leia, looking just like she did in the 1970s, but it was new footage. Because, of course, it was animation, it was computer generated. It was pretty good. You could still tell it was animation, but only just. And this is the kind of technology that we're using now when making video games and cinema films. So we're very good at making human-like animated faces. Another example of things that a neural network can do, you're all familiar with this lady. You all know that there's only one picture of her, or maybe two, actually, I was reading the other day, in existence. And the moving footage that you can see there is an example of what an adversarial neural network, a kind of AI, can do with a single still image, create moving footage from a single still. And you might look at particularly the one in the middle and go, well, she doesn't look that much like Mona Lisa when she's moving. That's because the algorithm is having to invent different facial angles because there's only one in the picture. The more still images you have, the higher the quality of the generated video at the end. So if you've got 8 stills or 16 stills, the quality goes up exponentially. So we already see deepfake out there in the wild. This was a deepfake video of Zuckerberg. If you haven't had the chance to see it, go find it. Facebook have actually said that they're going to leave it up on Facebook, even though they didn't post it. It was part of an art project. There was Zuckerberg, there was Kim Kardashian, and it's very amusing stuff to watch. But we're already seeing very realistic-looking deepfake type stuff. Now, one of the attacks that's quite prevalent is a thing called business email compromise, where in a business email compromise scenario, an attacker will compromise an inbox belonging to a senior executive within your organization, and they will use that compromised inbox to send an email to someone in the finance part of the organization with a fake invoice for payment. And the finance person will say, oh, this came from the CEO, I better pay it. And the CEO's mail will have some urgency and say, it must be close of business Friday, otherwise it'll be terrible, and so on. And so far, $13 billion worth of damages have been done to companies around the world through business email compromise, just by sending an email. So imagine a future where you start to put all of these technologies together, and you'll no longer be looking at business email compromise, you'll be looking at business FaceTime compromise or business Skype compromise. You wake up in the morning to a FaceTime from the CEO that says you must change your password to this is a really easy password, and you must do it immediately because I need to log into your account, or whatever. Whatever social engineering you want to put on top of that technological base. But we used to say on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. You're going to have to change that to on the internet, no one knows anything. You will no longer be able to believe your eyes and ears unless you're physically in the same room as the person. And given that we're moving away from talking to people, that's less and less likely to happen. And not only that, another area where, imagine this scenario, and this is a real screenshot of someone's website. It's a company that's in beta right now, but they're promising you digital immortality. So we're all worried about what happens when we die. Arguably, that's why we have religion in the first place, is to kind of help us feel a bit more comfortable about being dead. That's what I think, anyway. So if we're searching for immortality, if there's a company that you sign up and you answer a bunch of questions about yourself and you tell them where is your Facebook, where is your Twitter, where is your Snapchat, your Instagram, all of that stuff, and they just follow you all the time when you're alive, and then when you die, they become you. So you don't die online. So you imagine like the day of your funeral, hi mom, I'm dead, or something. But put that together with fake audio, which we can already do, deep fake video, which we can already do, creating people that have never existed and animating them like it's real footage, and then having something not only that knows what you look like and what you sound like, but what you act like, and put it with all of the other AI and think of the kinds of new threat models that will be out there, just misusing those kinds of technologies. And one that worries me more than many others, although it's not particularly business-focused, is the idea of deepfake ransomware. So there's already a sextortion scam where mostly teenagers will be caught on their own webcams doing something embarrassing, and then they will be extorted by criminals with the threat of publishing that video online. Well, just think about if all you need is a still photo of your victim and an email address, because you can gather those, no problem, right? You don't actually need them to do anything anymore. So that kind of threat model, that kind of extortion, that will lead to death. That's already led to suicides in its current form. It will lead to many more. So there are some really serious aspects to these threats as well. Of course, it's not just consumer. There's industrial IoT, an area where I know many of you focus. It's in full growth right now, particularly in manufacturing. And I think that growth is set to continue. Not only is it in full growth in terms of technology and adoption, it's in full growth in terms of vulnerabilities as well. So through the Zero Day Initiative, which is the part of my organization that runs the Pwn2Own, the hacking contest, we buy research from security researchers, vulnerabilities, and then we work with the affected vendor to get that patched, and then we release a notification. For ICS, you can see the difference between the number notified in 2017 and the number of vulnerabilities published in 2018. It's absolutely huge exponential growth in terms of, because people are actively looking at this stuff now to find vulnerabilities. Luckily, the number of zero-day notifications that we publish has gone down, which means that manufacturers are getting better at working with us to get the vulnerabilities fixed before we do the notification, so that's good. But the fact is, many of these devices were not designed with security in mind. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because you probably wouldn't put your hand up, but I'm fairly sure that many of you don't really think about security when you're building the things that you build. You don't have to tell me I'm right, because I know I am. So you really have to. You really need to. Especially when I look at that video this morning of all the different use cases, launching intercontinental ballistic missiles from super yachts needs security. But the truth is, the way it stands right now, we did our own survey of businesses through in about 4 countries in Europe, and these were the results. People were not involving their security teams when they were planning IoT deployments. Only 38% of organizations actively involved the security team in a deployment. They acknowledged that they were being attacked, that they were having a certain number of attacks directly on connected devices rather than traditional systems. And almost all of them recognized that deployments of connected technology have led to severe security incidents within their environments. So this isn't a theoretical threat. This is what's happening right now. And in many cases, the things you build are the things that are causing these problems for organizations. That's why you need to pay attention on a security level. The other people who are paying attention are the attackers. And actually, nation-state-sponsored activity directly focused at industrial control systems and SCADA-type technology has been steady, has been slow, but is absolutely continuing. We've seen, obviously, Stuxnet that came, I'm not saying this is true, but nominally came from the US and Israel. They've effectively put their hands up to that being a US-Israel joint venture, which was malware targeted at uranium enrichment facilities in Iran. It would spin the centrifuge so fast that it would crack and stop them being able to refine the uranium. That worked. That was probably the first one. That was opening Pandora's box. And since then, we've seen nation-state-sponsored things looking at attacks on the electricity infrastructure in Ukraine, turning off the power to hundreds of thousands of people in the Ukraine in December. So it's really seriously cold and the electricity goes off. And this is still, from a nation-state level, this is still in a period of test. And we're already talking about affecting hundreds of thousands of people within a target country. And then most recently, we've seen things like ransomware as a threat type being retargeted to attack production and industrial facilities for people who are making chemicals, people who are making aluminium have had their operations entirely interrupted by very targeted but very simple ransomware type attacks. So when I think from a security perspective, and I think what is the reality today, the sad truth is that in many security operations centers within organizations, it looks like this. People don't like to admit it, but there is so much going on that the security operations center is completely unaware of. So we all have to play a role in bringing those numbers down. I said I would put some numbers on it earlier on. So here's an illustration of the scale of the problem. There was a survey recently. It was actually a survey in the financial sector, but I think it's broadly true in general. More than 60% of respondents to the survey said that their organizations dealt with 100,000 plus alerts every day in their security operations center. So these are alerts from security technology saying something. So if you think every alert takes maybe 25 minutes worth of work, because you've got to say, is this alert a duplicate of something else? Have I already dealt with it? Is it relevant? What's the severity? Is it a false positive? Is it actually an alert for something that it shouldn't be an alert for? Is it a true positive? And doing all of that triage, right? 25 minutes per alert is kind of a reasonable estimate for that. But if you've got 100,000 alerts at 25 minutes per alert, you've got 2.5 million minutes worth of work just to do the triage. So if you wanted to put that in human terms, you would need a SOC team, a Security Operations Center team of 217 people divided in 3 8-hour shifts to do it 24/7. Just to do the triage. That's without taking any action as a result of those alerts. And that's quite honestly the situation that security is in today. So we all have our role to play in making sure that our customers, your customers, are not finding themselves in this unmanageable situation, because that is unmanageable and will remain unmanageable. You won't fix that by throwing people at it, because the data is only growing. So I wanted to leave you with just a few ideas, areas to focus, ways to think maybe when you're coding, designing, building, architecting, even marketing the things that you make. And they're these. When you are building an environment or a system or an object, at the time when you're building it, designing it, assume compromise. Don't assume that you're working with a clean environment. Make sure that the thing that you're making is able to recognize malicious activity, even from what you think is a clean baseline. Assume compromise, whether it's a network you're building or a service or a physical device. Assume that what you're putting together is already compromised and design security around that to cope with that reality. If you're going to fail, make sure you fail securely. There's a lot of conversation in my industry about whether things should fail open or fail closed. It's actually irrelevant. fail securely. That might be open, that might be closed, but consider the implications of each and make your decision accordingly. Always consider the misuse case. A lot of people like to say, think like a hacker, but I don't think that's very useful. That's like telling someone who's just been stabbed to think like a doctor. Doesn't help very much. So when you're doing things, always consider the misuse case. What happens if I press this button? What happens if I put too much data in this buffer? What happens further down the line? And build in mitigations for those misuses, because people will break your stuff deliberately and accidentally. Remember that listening is learning. If you're speaking, you're not learning. If you're speaking, you're only repeating the things that you already know. So make sure that you spend a lot of time listening to the people around you, the people in your team, the people outside your industry. I learn a lot by coming to things like this because I have no idea what you do on a daily basis. Remember that security is not something you will ever reach, but it's something that you should continue striving to achieve. You will never build a fully secure system, but you should keep trying to do so. And remember that whatever you do with security, it can't be security for the sake of it. It must be security for the sake of the business or the business that is your end customer. Thank you very much.